So in our first session last week, we spoke about the Midrash Halacha and what is Midrash Halacha. What is it based on, right? What are the tools that Midrash Halacha uses? So it's important to understand the term itself, Midrash Halacha, and because it became a misnomer. People say Midrash generally without specifying. The word Midrash per se means the act of deriving meaning from a text, which is basically the function of language everywhere. Whenever we say a word, we convey something and the listener is supposed to derive a meaning from it. When the text is legal, it becomes more complicated because the meaning that you will derive from the text will become binding as law. Now, the original form of Midrash was Midrash Halacha, meaning applying that system of seeking the meaning of the text only in the Halacha parts of the Torah, not in the narrative. Then it was expanded also to the narrative. And then at that point, there was a distinction between Midrash Halacha, seeking the meaning of the text to derive a halacha from it, and Midrash Agadah, interpreting the narrative in the Torah. But then the word Midrash became a sort of general word to everything in rabbinical literature, which is not halacha. So we have to be careful when we say Midrash Halacha, this is what we refer to. I mentioned that there are 3 volumes, important volumes of Midrash Halacha: the Mechilta on Shemot, the Sifra on Vaikra, and the Sifrei on Bamidbar Devarim. Traditionally, when I say traditionally in the Orthodox world, the belief is that the rabbis used the tools of interpretation called Midot Torah Nidreshet Bahem, the Midot, or the methods. Midah literally means measurement or measure. So when you apply it to character traits, it will be attributes. When you talk about the ways of interpreting the Torah, it means a method. So the different methods of interpreting the Torah are called midot, and traditionally we have this belief that we have 13 midot, and that they were given alongside the oral law to Moshe on Har Sinai, and therefore the interpretation of the text by those midot, the process of interpretation and the conclusion are all divine. This is the Orthodox belief. And what we've seen last week, we started going through the sugya in Talmud Bavli about the question of Pesach that falls on Shabbat. What do you do when the 14th of Nisan falls on Shabbat? Whether you could bring a korban or not. And I explained that the reason for that doubt was that Pesach is an individual korban that is brought by everyone. So it falls in between the public sacrifice, which one can bring on, the Kohanim would sacrifice on Shabbat, and the personal individual korban, which one cannot bring on Shabbat. And we read this case where the Bnei Betera, the heads of the Sanhedrin, the religious decisors of the nation at the time, didn't know what to do. Nita'alma halacha, they forgot, they didn't know, and they had to ask for help. And the person who comes for help is Hillel Bavli. And in the way the story is presented in the Bavli, they raise the question. Hillel comes and says, yes, you can bring the Pesach on Shabbat. He uses some interpretive tools, and the presidents, Bnei Betera, accept his words immediately and appoint him to be their leader. And he expounds on the laws of Pesach the whole day. Now we'll see from the Yerushalmi that the story is not exactly this. And later on, when we get to the question of the development of Bavli and Yerushalmi, we will see that there was great injustice done to the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi was a valid method of interpreting the Mishnah, and actually had greater authority in explaining the Mishnah, because the Talmud Yerushalmi, as the name indicates, was written in Eretz Israel, not really in Yerushalayim, because Yerushalayim was not at the time a place where Jews could live, but it was uh, referred to as Talmud Yerushalmi because Yerushalayim is the capital of Eretz Israel, and that is how it uh, was recorded in some sources. Other names for Talmud Yerushalmi as Talmudat Eretz Israel, the Talmud of Eretz Israel, or Talmud of Ma'arava, the Talmud of the West. But in any case, much later than the period that we're talking about, maybe 600 or 700 years later, the yeshivot of Bavel wanted to bring down the yeshivot of Eretz Israel. Maybe not the yeshivot in general. Several individuals who headed the Torah institutions in Bavel wanted to downplay the role of the Eretz Israel yeshivot in the transmission of the Torah, and they claimed that the Torah in Eretz Israel was inaccurate. One cannot rely on the teachings coming from Eretz Israel, because the Jews in Israel lived for hundreds of years under the rule of the Romans, and then the Byzantine Empire under the rule of Christianity. So they called the Torah Torah Shmad. As a result, people stopped learning this Talmud written in Eretz Israel, which reflected more faithfully the Mishnah, because the authors of the Talmud of Eretz Israel lived in proximity of time and space to the authors of the Mishnah. So once they became sort of illegal, right, or secondary, and people stopped studying that, the living tradition of understanding the Yerushalmi has been forgotten, and now the Bavli took over, and we lost sort of the ability to fully understand the Talmud Yerushalmi. Now, when we go to this story, we'll see that when Hillel comes with his methods of interpretation of the Torah, he is not received with open arms the way it is described in the Bavli. Okay, so the different versions of the same story. And as I said, Yerushalmi is probably more authentic. Why would the Babylonian Talmud deviate from the original story? There is an interest in showing that those interpretive methods are of divine origin, or they have a tradition and are not newly introduced by Hillel. They have the same fear that still exists until today in the Orthodox world. The fear is that if we will demonstrate, whether it's one halacha or several halachot, if we will demonstrate that there was no the idea of an uninterrupted chain of transmission from Moshe down to the rabbis, down to our ages, is incorrect, that there somewhere was either there was no tradition, the rabbis created halakha with their own interpretation. So the fear is that this will bring down the whole system. Because if I say that this is not correct, this specific halakha was created by the rabbis, then maybe everything else was created by them, and then people would reject the whole system. That's why there's so much emphasis in the Orthodox world. When you study Talmud, anyone who studied Daf Yomi or Talmud knows that there's great insistence on showing that the system is cohesive, that everything fits in, that everything relies, all the parts fit in, they rely one layer on another, all the way back to allegedly to Moshe Rabbeinu. So let's look at this story of the Yerushalmi. If you had the chance to look at the file that Shayna prepared, I thought she shared with everyone a good analysis of the text. But let me go to the text of the Yerushalmi. I have it only in Hebrew, or Aramaic. I'll read and explain. This is the Yerushalmi in Tractate Pesachim, 6th chapter. So we go here. So you will see that the story is pretty similar, but I'm going to point out the differences. So that we read this. Elu devarim bepesach, halacha ne'ilma miziknei betera. The elders of the house of Betera forgot the halacha. Ne'ilma meaning they knew it and they forgot it, or they were unable to decipher it. Could be this is the first time that such a case appears in front of them. Remember that we mentioned last week that the issue of whether you could carry the knife on Shabbat was forgotten, and then the people provided the solution by letting the animals carry the knife, which I think is the irony of the whole story, that had the rabbis from the very beginning go to the people and ask them, do you remember what to do in such a situation? The people would know the answer. But instead, they deal with the problem at the level of the leadership. The rabbis are discussing, it's almost as if you would say that, you have two rabbis asking how long does it take to boil a pot of water, right? And they deal with it theoretically. And they're trying to bring proofs from text or whatever, because none of them ever put a pot of a kettle of water on the fire. And if said they could go out to the marketplace and ask someone, they will tell them it takes 5 minutes or 7 minutes or whatever. So this is the story. So the 14th day of Nisan falls on Shabbat. They did not know whether Pesach overrides Shabbat or not. Amru, yesh kan Bavli echad. They said there's one Babylonian. So note in the Talmud Bavli it says Adam echad yesh she'ala mi Bavel. We have a person, a man, who migrated from Bavel. It sounds more respectful. Here Hillel is being put down from the beginning. Bavli echad is one Babylonian. The Babylonians were not welcomed in Israel. They didn't like them. There were cases of rabbis from Babylonia who made aliyah, who came to Israel and were punched in the face publicly. There were 3 or 4 cases like that reported in the Talmud. And the word Bavli actually became a derogatory term. If you wanted to insult someone, you would tell them you're a Babylonian. In Tractate Yoma, the Mishnah speaks about the annoying people who would surround the Kohen on Yom Kippur when the Kohen would take the scapegoat to take it out to the desert. The people would congregate around the Kohen and say, go already, like, because they believe that the scapegoat carries their sins and they wanted to get out of the way. And the Mishnah said those people were from Bavel, they were from Babylonia. But a later commentary explains that they were not from Babylonia. They were Egyptians. They were from Alexandria. So why did you call them Babylonians? To shame them. So this is how the term, there was such animosity at a certain point between the scholars of Bavel and Israel, that to say there is a Bavli here, there's a Babylonian man, was considered an insult. So they say יש כאן בבלי אחד ששימש את שמעיה ואבטליון, יודע אם פסח דוחה את השבת אם לאו, he knows whether Pesach overrides Shabbat or not, אפשר שיש ממנו תוחלת. Those are words that are not in the Bavli. They say maybe we could get something out of him. Tohelet is hope, or maybe he could tell us something. So they cast doubt on the ability of Hillel to determine the halacha. Shalhu v'kar'u lo. So they sent out and they called this Hillel. Amru lo, shamarta miyamecha. So they asked him the question, shamarta miyamecha. Have you ever heard? It's important because in the Bavli, the version is ata yodea. Do you know whether it overrides Shabbat or not? Let me keep the Bavli next to me open so it's easier to. I'll have one open, physical book, and one in the. So. Yeah, any questions on that? Let me see the chat. Okay, so in the Bavli, like as I said, do you know whether this happened or not? Okay, but in the Yerushalmi, shamata. So the emphasis in the Yerushalmi is on shmu'ah, on oral transmission, whereas in the Bavli is on the ability of interpretation. Haim Ovadia, do you know, right? So they ask him, when the 14th fall on Shabbat, does it override Shabbat or not? So he answers with a question, right, as a good Jew. אמר להם, וכי אין לנו אלא פסח אחד בלבד שדוחה את השבת, והלא כמה פסחים ידחו את השבת בכל שנה. He says, do we only have one Pesach which overrides Shabbat? There are many Pesach sacrifices that override Shabbat. Now, in the Bavli, it says right away that he said 200 Pesachim, but in the Yerushalmi, it says, It tan yetane me'ah, it tan yetane matayim, it tan yetane shloshmot. There's a debate on what is the number that he told them, 100, 200, 300. And the question depends whether he includes only the daily sacrifices of Shabbat. The one who says Mea is Tmidin, is the daily sacrifices. The one who says Matayim counts also Tmidin umusfei Shabbatot, not only the daily sacrifice, but also the one that is added on Shabbat. And the one who says 300 includes Tmidin umusafei Shabbatot, shel yamim tovim v'shel roshei chodashim v'shel mu'adot. So it includes all the additional sacrifices that might fall on Shabbat. But in any case, it ranges between 100 and 300 animals that are annually sacrificed on Shabbat. אמרו לו, כבר אמרנו שיש ממך תוחלת. Now, in the Bavli, the answer is minayin lecha. How do you know? Here they say, we said maybe there's hope from you. Meaning, again, it's sort of a little bit disrespectful that we doubted whether we could have something from you, but it seems like something will emerge from our discussion. So what did he do? התחיל דורש להם מהיקש ומקל וחומר ומגזרה שווה. So he starts using three interpretational methods. One is called hekesh. One is the kal vachomer, one is gzera shava. So hekesh is analogy. It comes literally from the word lehakish, which is to bang two objects, to cling two objects towards one another like this, and you hear the sounds called nekisha. So lehakish is to say A and B are the same. That's the idea. Kal vachomer is a fortiori. If something applies to this, even more so it should apply to that. And Gzera Shava is an analogy based on the text. We have similar texts, similar words in the text, and then we derive Gzera Shava from one to another. Now, an important note to take here. I mentioned the list of the 13 attributes, or the 13 methods of interpretation called Midot Shatorah Nidreshet B'hem. Only two of those three appear in the list, and those are the Kal Vachomer, Gzera Shava. But this one, Hekesh, does not appear in the list. So it's interesting that Hillel is using two methods that are in the official list of the 13 methods, and one that is not. And we'll get to that also when we look at the Baraita, at that text of Rabbi Ishmael. So he uses three types of interpretive methods. So let's see how he does that. Mekesh. So the first thing that he does is analogy. So a logical analogy. Ho'il vetamid korban tzibur. Ufesach korban tzibur. He says both of these korbanot, the daily sacrifice, right? One lamb in the morning, one lamb in the afternoon. This korban tamid, the daily or perpetual korban, is a public sacrifice. It is brought by the public. And the Pesach is also a public sacrifice. So just as the Tamid, the daily sacrifice, overrides Shabbat, so also Pesach should override Shabbat. That is a Hekesh. It's an analogy that is not text-based. You see, it doesn't provide any text to rely on. It just said conceptually, I look at the details of this korban, the daily sacrifice, and I note that it is a public sacrifice, and I know that it is sacrificed on Shabbat. So now I look at Korban Pesach. I know that it is a public sacrifice. I don't know whether it is sacrificed on Shabbat or not. So I take the missing element from the daily sacrifice and I apply it to Pesach. That's the Hekesh. Okay. Any questions here? Up here on that? Okay. Now, what is the Kal Vachomer? We said that Kal Vachomer is a fortiori, meaning if, from the word forte, which is strength, if the halacha is such and such in a more lenient case, even more so in a more difficult case, right? If the mother doesn't allow the child to play in front of the house, of course she's not going to let him play across the street, right? Because it's a greater level of danger. It's a very simple logical process. So what is this Kal Vachomer? It says, Uma im tamid she'en havim al asiyato koret dochet HaShabbat. If one does not bring the daily sacrifice, there's no punishment for that. It's a failure, but there's no punishment for it. But if one did not bring the Korban Pesach she'havim al asiyato koret, if one did not bring the Korban, he will be punishable by karet, which is not administered by a human court, but rather by heavens. But it means that one will die at a young age or will die without children. But there is a punishment for that. So now the logic of Hillel is, if I weigh the two sacrifices side by side, right? Which one of them has greater importance? Pesach, because if you don't bring the Korban Pesach, you will be punished for it. If you don't bring the Korban Tamid, you will not be punished for it. So he says, if the Korban Tamid, for which you will not be punished, is sacrificed on Shabbat, the Korban Pesach, for which you will be punished if you don't bring it, of course, could come on Shabbat. So that's his second method. The third method is this. Migzera shava. Remember, Gzera shava, ligzor literally means to cut, usually with scissors. So Gzera shava is sort of, you could say, like the idiom in English, to be cut from the same fabric, to have the same shape, the same way of cutting it. So Gzera shava, I cut the fabric here in one manner and here in the same manner, and now those two pieces of fabric fit each other. So what is the Gzera shava? Ne'emar betamid bemu'ado. When we talk about tamid, the Torah uses the word on its time, on its designated time, meaning you always bring it on time. V'ne'emar b'pesach bemu'ado. And regarding Pesach, it also says bemu'ado, you have to bring it on the designated time. Just as when the Torah says, bring it on the designated time regarding the daily korban, daily sacrifice, it means on Shabbat also, meaning the mu'ed, the idea of bring it on the right date, which is every day, overrides the importance of Shabbat. Av Pesach shenemar b'mu'ado dochet HaShabbat. So Pesach also, where the word mu'ed is mentioned, can override Shabbat. So up until here, it's more or less like the Yerushalmi with the Bavli, with slight differences, which were, so far, he is not referred to with great respect. They doubt whether he knows or doesn't know the answer, and they don't ask him to provide proofs, but rather to relay a tradition that he heard from his rabbis, right? So now he comes with this sort of great pride, and he was a humble man, but it's like he's able to, like in a test, shoot back 1, 2, 3. I have 3 logical proofs that you can bring the Korban Pesach on Shabbat, but he's met with opposition. Amru lo, kvar amarnu im yesh tochelet mi Bavli. We know it that we cannot rely on a Babylonian man. We know that we cannot expect you to give us hope. This is the exact opposite of what we read in the Talmud Bavli. In the story in the Bavli, the Talmud says, after he said what he said, מיד הושיבוהו בראש, והחל דורש, ומינו נשיא עליהן, והיה דורש כל היום כולו. Immediately, when they heard his response, they made him the president of the Bedin, and he started expounding on the laws of Pesach. But here they say, no. This doesn't work for us. Why? Hekesh she'amarta yesh lo tshuva. So, okay, let's start with your logical arguments one by one. You start with the hekesh, the logical analogy, the comparison of two laws. And what did you say? You said just as the korban tamid, the daily korban, which is a public korban and it is sacrificed on Shabbat, so also the Pesach, which is a public korban, should be brought on Shabbat. They say no. This analogy is incorrect. Why? Because the point of departure, which is the tamid, is not the same as the goal. You want to compare tamid with Pesach, but they're not the same. Why? אם אמרת בתמיד שכן יש לו קצבה, תאמר בפסח שאין לו קצבה. Tamid has a set number of animals, whether it's the tamid or the additional korbanot of Shabbat, whatever it is, there's always a set number, the same amount of animals that will be brought every Shabbat, one in the morning, one in the evening. If it's Sukkot, there will be 7 oxen or something like that, whatever it is. But the number is clearly written in the Torah. You know exactly what you bring. On Pesach, there's no set number. It depends on how many people will come to have their Pesach in Yerushalmi. If there could be 50,000, it could be 100,000. In other words, they tell him the fact that he doesn't have a set amount of sacrifices conveys the fact that it is an individual korban, not mandated by the Torah that you bring a korban as the public. So they reject his analogy, his illogical interpretation. Kal v'chomer she'amarta yesh lo tshuva. Now you said a kal v'chomer. What was the kal v'chomer? He said if you could bring the tamid on Shabbat, and the tamid is not that severe, you're not going to be punished for it. So even more so, you could bring the Pesach, that if you don't bring it, you will be punished for it. They say no, yesh lo tshuva. In the same manner that they rejected his first argument by showing that the two compared items are not similar. Here they're going to say we are going to reject the a fortiori by proving that what you called weak is not weak compared to the other one. Like the whole idea of kal v'chomer is that you have kal, lenient or weak, v'chomer, strict or strong, right? So when you compare the daily korban and the Pesach, you say the daily korban is weak because there's no punishment for failing to bring it, and the Pesach is strong because if you fail to bring it, you're punished. But what if I show you a strength for the daily korban that does not exist with the Pesach korban? Then they are on different levels. You cannot derive comparison from one to another because they are. I'll give an analogy to explain that. Right? Let's say two students are going to take a test in history, right? And we want to figure out we want to predict whether they're going to succeed in the test or not. And I will say, student A is not so strong in math, and yet he excelled in. Not math. Okay, student A is not so strong in physical education, and yet he excelled in math. So of course he's going to excel in history as well, right? And student A is not so strong in physical education. Student B is strong, right? So if student A, who's not strong in math, excelled in history, definitely the other one will too. I think I messed up the example. Right, I have to think it through. It's been a long time since I was in high school. Uh, in any case, like if student A, who's strong on this subject, was able to do the history test, definitely the second student who's strong in this, the first subject will succeed in history. But then if we prove that there are weaknesses of the second student that the first one doesn't share, then the whole thing falls. So here's the same thing they do. This is what they do here. Kal v'chomer she'amarta yesh lo tshuva. The a fortiori that you try to prove is wrong, is faulty. Why? Im amarta betamid shu kodesh kodashim. Your whole thing rested on the idea that tamid is of a lesser degree of severity because there's no punishment for liking to bring it. But in terms of the sanctity of the korban, tamid is kodesh kodashim. Tamid should be burnt completely on the altar. And if the animal that was supposed to be the tamid was taken out by mistake, it is disqualified. It cannot leave the precincts of the temple. Whereas the Pesach is allowed to leave after being sacrificed the precincts of the temple, and you could eat it. So the tamid is weak on one side, strong on another. Pesach is weak on strong on the first side, weak on the other. So there's no way to compare the two. So the kal v'chomer falls. Finally, they get to gzera shava. Gzera shava she'amarta she'en adam dan gzera shava me'atzmo. Now you made a comparison between the two psukim. You said the Torah says bemuado here on its time regarding the daily korban, and the Torah says bemuado here regarding the Pesach. Just as the tamid should be brought on time even on Shabbat, so also the Pesach. Here the rejection is not logical. They don't say it doesn't make sense. We can reject the logic of your argument, but rather they say you don't have the authority to say it. So interesting, right? We have three. Well, he uses three methods, right? For the first one, they reject on the basis of analogy. They are not similar. The second one, they pull the rug from under the concept of a fortiori. One is weak, one is strong. They show him that both are weak and strong. And the third one, they say you don't have the authority to produce such a logical argument. Why? She'en adam dan gzera shava me'atzmo. One cannot use this method of interpretation called gzera shava on his own. And after I read the next phase, we will stop for a second, with the text and discuss it, more in depth. Rabbi Yosef be Rabbi Bon Amar b'shem Rabbi Babar Mamal. One of the rabbis said, "Im ba adam ladun achar gezerah shava me'atzmo, oseh et asheretz metameh ba'oel v'tamet metameh b'cha'adasha." It says, if one decides to go with gezerah shava, with this kind of interpretive tool by himself, meaning not relying on tradition, he could reverse the laws of purity and impurity. And then he goes on to say another rule: Adam dan gzera shava lekayem talmudo, ve'en Adam dan gzera shava levatel talmudo. One could make a gzera shava, can make this kind of interpretive process only to support that which he heard from his rabbi, but not to disprove what he studied, what he learned from his rabbi. Now, in another place in the Talmud says that you could only use that method of analogy, of gezerah shava, of comparing two texts, right, to one another, if the words are superfluous, if you have words that are not necessary for that text, and then you compare them to one another. So now, the question is, the big question that hovers above this, the idea of gezerah shava, of the analogy, is what is the power of a logical, analytical tool if you cannot use it? How come the rabbi said you could only you cannot say gezerah shava on your own? You have to have heard it from your rabbi. and they say you could only use it to support that which you've already learned. Right? How does it make sense? So who drew the line? At what point in history did we say, okay, up until now you could say Gzera Shava, from now on you can't? And if we take into account the other rule that says you could use the Gzera Shava, the analogy of texts, only if the words are superfluous, then what's the point of tradition? I don't need tradition. Either one rule tells me that in order to make a Gzera Shava, I have to have superfluous words in the verses that I'm interpreting, and another rule says you have to have tradition. So this issue was addressed by my professor in Bar Ilan, Professor Gilat of blessed memory, who explained that there was a development in the process of doing Gezerah Shava, and that at a certain point the rabbis had to limit the use of Gezerah Shava because of what the Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Bon says in the Talmud that we just read. He said, "Im ba adam ladun gezerah shava me'atzmo," if you do it on your own, you could reverse the whole legal system. Because think of it for a moment. If we base the gezerah shava on words in the Torah, similar words, how many words are similar in the Torah? Where do we say this is similar, this is not similar, right? Am I going to look at every place where the word Shamayim, heaven, is mentioned, and I say whatever he said about the heavens here applies to everywhere where the heavens appear, right? Or for example, the Torah says in one place that ve'achlu otam, right? And you have to eat the sacrifice. Does it mean that wherever the Torah says the word ve'achal, that you have to eat, it's the same manner of eating in the same place, in the same manner of, it's impossible. So what happened here? How did this midah evolve? So the theory is that originally the comparison between two texts to arrive at a conclusion called Gzera Shava, even though it used a word in the text, it wasn't really the word, but rather the concept. Meaning, Hillel uses, let's look again at the text and see what is the Gzera Shava that he uses. They reject him, but really not with a great justification, because his Gzera Shava is valid. He uses the word bemuado. See this word bemuado. Bemuado means on its designated time. The Torah says you have to bring the daily sacrifice every day, one in the morning, one in the afternoon, and you have to do it bemuado, on time. Regarding the Pesach, it says you have to bring the Pesach on the 14th of Nisan, and you must do it bemuado. Now, when Hillel says we do Gzera Shava, it's not a superficial Gzera Shava. It's not just because the word bemuado appears in both psukim, just because it sounds the same, it means that both halachot are the same, but rather it's conceptual. Hillel says the word bemuado regarding the daily korban means that the importance of bringing the korban on the designated date, which in this case is every day, overrides anything else, including Shabbat. And therefore, I understand that the insistence of the Torah on the word bemuado regarding Pesach means that it overrides the importance of Shabbat. So his analogy is conceptual, not textual. But what happened was that with time, once this midah was introduced and people learned how to use it, they started to use it freely. They started to make, and they could have reached conclusions that made no sense. The rabbis saw the danger. So they made the first rule. The first rule was, you cannot make such an analogy unless you have superfluous words, meaning you have to find words in the Torah that originally should not have been there. I mean, you could have written the text differently. And if you find an extra word, then you have a ground to claim that there is an analogy here. But still, at that phase, the freedom of interpretation was left to each and every commentator. But then even that got out of hand, because it was easy for people to say, this word is superfluous. You could have written it differently. I once did sort of an experiment, which I recommend, by the way. And every time you read the Gemara or Midrash Halacha, and you see that they derive certain meaning from the pasuk or from the words, right? You should ask yourself, how else would the text be written? For example, I give you an example. In Megillat, in Masechet Megillah, the Mishnah says that even though in Megillat Esther it says that we read the Megillah on either the 14th or the 15th of Adar, right? Depends if you live in a walled city or not. The Mishnah says that you could, sometimes you read the Megillah on the 11th or 12th or 13th of Adar. And that depends on whether you live in a big city or in a village. If you live in a big city, there will always be a forum to read the Megillah, and you will read it either on the 14th or the 15th. But if you live in a small village, you will read the Megillah on the day that everybody travels to the big city. And when does everybody travel? Either on Monday or on Thursday, because that's the time for the Beit Din to convene. So they say if the 14th falls on a Monday, if the 14th falls on a Tuesday, you could read on the 13th because on Monday you'll be in town. And so on. If the 14th falls on a Wednesday, you read on a Monday, which will be the 12th of the month. If it falls on a Friday, then you read on the 11th, and so on. I mean, the Mishnah adds 3 additional dates for Purim, for reading the Megillah. So the Talmud asks, where do you take it from? How do you know that there are 3 other, early voting, sort of, right? Early Megillah reading. How do you know that this is even permissible? So the Talmud answers, it is because the Megillah says that the Jews accepted the establishment of the holiday of Purim, לעשות את ימי הפורים האלה בזמניהם. To do those days, to celebrate those days, bizmanehem, in their designated times, in plural. So now, since it says bizmanehem, the Gemara says it could have said bizmanam, so I could learn from it something else, or it could have said bazman, on time. Bazman. And since it says bizmanehem in the plural, times, added 3 letters, I learned 3 extra dates. The problem is that if you know Tanakh and you know Hebrew, the phrase wouldn't make sense. That's not biblical Hebrew, that's modern Hebrew. So when you say, I could have written it differently, no, you couldn't. There's no way you could have written it differently in most cases. But if you insist, you could. There's a nice anecdote that it works well in Hebrew, that one of the early reformers of Jewish tradition came to a rabbi and said, I have a problem with the way the Torah is written. It says, what is your problem? It says Bereshit bara Elohim. Why use the word Bereshit? You could have used the word Batehila, which also means in the beginning. And then, okay, what else? He says, why bara, which means create? He could have said asa, which means he made. He says, okay, I hear. What else? He says, and why does it say Elokim? He could have said Hashem, right? So the rabbi told him, okay, wait a second. So what you're saying is that you want, instead of Bereshit bara Elokim, that it would be written Bathila asa Hashem? He said, yes. He said, that one was originally written, but your friend changed it. Meaning, you could always, argue that there would be a different text to put there, right? But this is how the Torah was written, and Rabbi Ishmael always insists, Dibra Torah kishon bnei adam. The Torah speaks the vernacular. If we would try to reduce the Torah to a dry legal text, nobody would be able to read it. So anyway, that was the problem. So the first phase, as I said, everybody was free to interpret the psukim with the Gzerah Shava, but using it as a logical tool based on it was a conceptual tool and not a textual tool. But then people took it to the textual level. So the rabbi said, okay, you're limited only if you have an extra word that you could expound on. But then everybody continued creating their own drashot. So the rabbi said, that's it, no more. And whenever this rule was made, we don't know exactly, but they said from this point on, no new drashot of Gzerah Shava. Only if you heard it from your rabbi, you could use it. If you didn't hear it, then it's invalid. But we see that they had great fear of people taking those midot and using them in an extreme manner. So in any case, the rabbis, the Bnei Betera, rejected the interpretation of Hillel. This is, as I said, in total opposition to what we read in the Talmud Bavli, where they appoint him as the president right away. So what happened here? Even though he was expounding on it all day long, they did not accept his interpretation. So those words that he said and taught these laws all day long also appear in the Bavli. But over there, they accepted him as a president and he started explaining other things. Here, he was working all day very hard to try to explain his point, and they did not accept it. He said, I swear that this is the halacha that I heard from my rabbis. And once they heard it, they said, okay, if you heard from them, you could be our rabbi, because you are a better carrier of tradition than we are. So what have we learned from the story in the Yerushalmi now? A completely different message than the Bavli. But then we'll also have to add the question of what do we learn from the evolution between the story in the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. So what we learn from the story of the Yerushalmi is this. First of all, some laws can be forgotten. And I mentioned last week as well. And some laws that are so apparently obvious or ubiquitous, like, do you bring Pesach on Shabbat? And those laws that were not forgotten by the people were forgotten by the rabbis. What we learn from the Yerushalmi, then when they try to establish the halacha, what is done, there is tension between the different rabbinical communities, between that of Eretz Israel and that of Bavel, and that when Hillel comes and says, I can teach you, based on drashot, they reject it. They say, we don't like your logical tools because you could manipulate your results the way you want it. That's how they reject his Gzerah Shava. So some of them are rejected on a logical basis, another on sort of political or pragmatic basis, which means that they are suspicious of this method of interpretation and they rely more on tradition. And that tells us that yes, we do have a body of oral law, a lot of halachot that were transmitted orally from generation to generation, but then from Hillel on, there is a phenomenon of people expounding on the Torah and adding their layers of interpretation to the Torah, to the text. We accept it as part of our tradition. That's fine. But we should know that it comes from a human and not a divine origin. And therefore, when there is a need to question a certain interpretation, we have to examine it from all angles and see whether it stands the test of time, of practice, of other sources that we have. Eventually, he's appointed a president only because he had the tradition. Now, the Bavli sort of erased all this conflict and said, the moment you come with your analytical tools, we accept it. So that marks the difference between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. It gives greater liberty to the ones who write halacha using those interpretive tools. So I think we will stop here today, but next week, and I'm going to send you the material, the references. Next week, we're going to look at the list of the 13 midot, as it appears, like the full list, and also how often are they used in rabbinical literature, which is important because we'll see by then whether they are really 13 equally used tools, or is it an attempt to create a list with a nice round number. So with that, we conclude the class recording, but stay on if you have some questions. I'm just stopping the recording.